want to open today with two readings. The first is by white 19th century Unitarian Universalist minister, poet, essayist, and leading transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds. There is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there's no bar or wall in the soul where we, the effect, cease and God, the cause, begins. I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. There is no deep power in which we exist and those whose bliss is accessible to us. Every moment when the individual feels is invaded by it is memorable. It comes to the lowly and the simple, and it comes to whoever will be put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight, it comes as serenity and grandeur. The soul's health consists in the fullness of its reception. Forever and ever, the influx of this better and more universal self is new and unsearchable. Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our soul, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it's love. Those are the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Our second reading is by white American poet, novelist, and social activist Marge Piercy. Two people can keep each other sane, can support conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge and start an organization. With six, you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen makes a demonstration, 100 fill a hall, 1,000 have solidarity and your own newspaper, 10,000 power and your own paper, 100,000 your own media, 10 million your own country. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again and they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. Those are the words of Marge Piercy. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably felt a tension between those two readings. One was Ralph Waldo Emerson and his transcendentalist, the divine, and connecting within with a higher power, with very little mention of any other people there. Then Marge Piercy, coming from the feminist tradition with this whole idea of relationships and this connections between people is what really makes life meaningful. So there's a real tension between those two readings. And I think that speaks to the tension we all have, especially in religious community, but in any group of people, that tension between individualism and being in community. And that's what I would like to talk about today. Now, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists were hugely influential in Unitarian side of a movement and Unitarian Universalism to today. And they do speak of that beautiful spirituality that is so important, that idea of being able to explore, to journey, that spiritual progress and revelation is not sealed, and we can keep searching for that which is divine to us, within us and beyond us. And that radical individualism, which is such a part of our North American and Western European culture, and such a part of our Unitarian Universalist tradition, has been very meaningful because it really expresses this idea of individual freedom. And individualism is its very core. It's got this sense of liberty and freedom of the individual and the autonomy of the individual from away from institutions, be they religious, be they governmental, be they institutional. And there's a value to that. And there's a tension to that. Because when we have that individual freedom. It can sometimes be a struggle to be a meaningful part of community, especially when disagreements occur. And we hear many people talk about Unitarian Universalists. They say, well, I like Unitarian Universalism because we can think whatever we want. Sorry to trouble you, but that's not true. We can think whatever we want anywhere. Yeah, there are creedal religions out there, but you can go anywhere and think whatever you want. That's not really unique to Unitarian Universalism, and it's not even true about Unitarian Universalism. Because we are an ethical religion. We have values that we subscribe to through our 7 principles, through our covenant that we read at the beginning of worship, of how we wish to relate to one another. That is part of who we are. You know, and it's complex, and I spoke about this a few weeks ago, that I know I can be sexist, I know I can be racist, I know I can be transphobic, I know I can be homophobic, but I make this promise, I covenant to try and overcome each of those. And I think that's a covenant, a Unitarian Universalist promise. We make that promise to each other. We want to transcend those. We're enculturated with biases and prejudices, and we seek to overcome those. And that's the promise we make, and we do that in relationship. But I'm not naive to the struggle of being in community. I mean, it's often, you've noticed a few meetings we have at UUFRC, and I remember hearing many years ago that the way you calculate an IQ of the meeting, you take the IQ of the person with the lowest IQ of the meeting, and then you subtract 5 for every other person in the meeting, and that's how you calculate the IQ of a meeting. And I get that frustration, but I also think that misses an important point. I think the IQ of a meeting, when you bring people together who are collaborating and co-creating together, who bring their different life experience, who bring their different strengths, their emotional strengths, their intellectual strength, their lived experiences, that raises the emotional IQ of the meeting, the social IQ of the meeting, and it produces some beautiful co-creative solutions to problems that no one of us could think by ourselves. So I think when we come together as a community, our emotional, our social, and probably even our intellectual IQ increases when we work together, not gets reduced. And we always have to ask ourselves, we have this freedom, and we often talk about freedom as what we're freedom from. We're freedom from tyranny, freedom from monarchy, freedom from fascism, freedom from those who seek to do us harm. And that's important. But I invite you to also think of the flip side of freedom. What's that freedom for? We know what we want freedom from, but what is that freedom for? And we have that freedom. How are we going to use that freedom to enrich the world? And I think one of the struggles that many in our denomination, in our religion have is we have put a political identity at the center of who we are and not a spiritual one. We've put a consumer identity of who we are and not a religious one. I invite each of us to think of who are you at your essence? And the problem with a consumer identity or a political identity, there's a sense of competition there. My political party won, yours lost. My consumer identity is competing for price, buying goods and defining ourselves through these material goods. And I really invite us to take a step back from that. And what would be a spiritual and religious identity? The spiritual, as Ralph Waldo Emerson talks about, that connection with something more powerful in yourself, more meaningful yourself, and that religious of how do we want to relate with one another? How do we want to be in relationship with one another? And the Baha'i leader, Greg Hodges, says, individualism can lead to a narrowing of the social vision. As a sense of community decline, we tend to associate with more people who are similar to us in some way. Instead of a broad, inclusive understanding of society and its needs, members of the individualistic society may tend to see the world predominantly through the lens of their own individual characteristics, the knowledge they have, and the way they apply it to the world. Those are the words of Baha'i leader Greg Hotchkiss. And I read that and I can't think of looking at this political divide that we have in our nation right now, where people are getting more and more entrenched with like-minded people. And they're not able to see the humanity in the other side and see things from a richer perspective. And I think, ironically, this groupishness, this gathering together in more like-minded people, has got its roots in individualism. And there's a huge, complex paradox in that. And as I said before, for me, Unitarian Universalism at its strongest, it's a relational theology. It's the relationships we have. It's the relationships we connect with our inner values and inner ideals and inner principles. And it's relational in how we connect with other people. And through a covenant, we make promises to one another of how we wish to be in relationship. And it's aspirational. We make mistakes. But one of the things about the covenant is that we promise that if we make a mistake, we'll acknowledge it. And we'll try and come back into healthy relationships with one another. That's the strength. It's a two-way promise. It's a promise to be, I am going to try and be like this. And if I fail to be like that, I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to try and do better. That's the strength of covenant, is relational. Yes, we may be a non-creedal relation, but we are a covenantal relationship, and we make promises and commitments to each other. And I think religion at one of its most fundamental level is, what are we willing to promise to each other and what are we willing to commit to each other? Because yes, we have freedom from something, but ultimately to make our lives meaningful, we need to make commitments for our life to something. And I invite you each to think, what are the commitments you wish to make to yourself, to your family, to your neighbors, to this religious community as we move into the exciting future together? And some of us have got a strong experiences of community. I know I experienced something that stays with me from when I was 17 years old. I was in my first year at college, and I was the first generation of my family to go to college. My family was coal mining, and it was the 1st of January 1980. And the reason I know that was my grand's 80th birthday. And we were at a big party at my aunt's house, and my gran had a lot of brothers and sisters. I think at one point I counted it up. I had like 32 great aunts and great uncles, some of it through marriage. We were having this big party for my grand's 80th birthday. My Uncle Jai, who I saw occasionally, but he wasn't a big part of my life, but I knew him and I loved him. He was great. He went down in the coal mines when he was 14. And he actually retired, unlike many in my family who died before retirement age, but well, the men in my family. And I was talking to him about what life was like in the coal mines. He was retired by this point. And he talked about it, it's quite tough. And I said to him in a party atmosphere, I said, I would really like to go down a coal mine sometime. He put his hand on his shoulder and looked at me and said, we did not send you to university for you to go down the coal mine. We did not send you. And as I say, I knew him, but he didn't really think of him as a big part of my life. But then I saw this sense of him, this working class community, this working class family. But when I went to university, I was representing a we. It wasn't just about me. I think when many of us look at our life, we'll see that. When did we represent a we and we didn't realize it? When we go out and do social justice work or connect with communities, we are going out as religious members of Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Redwood City. And I think as we move forward, we need to think of a we. What do we represent? What values do we represent as a community? What values do we want to pass out into the community as we connect with partnerships and community, as we do our justice work? What we do we want to represent, not what I want to represent. The retired Unitarian Universalist minister, Fred Moore, gave a speech about 8-9 years ago. He called Moving from I Church to Beloved Community. And he was really questioning this need that we are really going to grow our religious movement, both in numbers and influence. We need to get a broader sense of we and a broader sense of community. And one of the things that we're working on with the church leadership is this idea of a strategic plan. And Solveig mentioned earlier the idea of the one big idea. And that was an attempt to try and get us to working together as a community. And I want to, the strategic plans, in other words, where we'll have strategic objectives to try and give ourselves some focus, some vision of where we're trying to move to together as a community. Because I know it's very easy as individuals that we're really passionate about things and we go off and do things, and that's great. And this is not an either or, this is a both and. Those can happen, but what do we want to come together as a community, and how do we want to move forward together? I think that's a really rich possibility. And to do that, we are all going to have to make compromises. We're all going to have to make sacrifices. Because one of the things about Unitarian Universalism, our covenant says that we all deserve to be listened to, but none of us get our own way, including me, the minister, and perhaps especially me, the minister, doesn't get our own way. And that's okay, because we need to come up with a common vision of where we want to go as a community. Where do we want to go together? Where do we want to journey forward as a community? And this strategic plan that we're coming up with strategic objectives, this is the work of the congregation. It's not my work. It's not the board's work. It's not the program council's work. It's our work as a community. Where do we want to go as a community? And how can we start working towards that as a wider community and not as separate individuals, not as these separate sticks where we may be strong, it can be broken by the forces in the world around us, but combined together in the true meaning of religious work to move forward, to transform the world through acts of love, which I believe is a fundamental goal of who we are as a religious community. And so when I talk about the church of one, I'm not talking about the church of one individual. I'm talking about the church of one vision, the church of one community, that diversity within one, the unity within our diversity. Because a common vision for a religious community balances and equalizes the individual with the group, which unlocks the power and value of both. So I'd like to finish now with a meditation. And these are the words of the great Unitarian Universalist, the late and great white Unitarian Universalist minister, Reverend Gordon McKeeman. Religion is all that we do together. Beloved community is that quality of being in community that affirms human dignity, beckons forth hidden possibilities, invites us into deeper, more constant, reverent relationships, and carries forward our heritage of hope and liberation. Worship is what we do together as we celebrate the triumphs of the human spirit, miracles of birth and life, wonders of devotion and sacrifice. Ministry is what we do together with one another in terror and torment, in grief, in misery and pain, enabling us in the presence of death to say yes to life. Spirituality is when we strive to speak and live the best we know, with full knowledge that it's never quite enough and yet are reassured by lostness found, fragments reunited, wounds healed, and joys shared. Religion is what we do together.